Welcome to tonight's presentation. I am Barbara Rimkunis, Co-Executive Director of the Exeter Historical Society. Tonight's program takes place in Musquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Wabanaki, Abenaki, and Pennacook peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Owaasak, the land, the waterways, flora, and fauna throughout the generations.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, my name is Laura Martin, and I'm the other co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society, and I'm glad that you're with us, either in person here at Town Hall or online. Thank you for coming to hear all about fierce female artists. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually, for which we are always grateful. Next month's program, to get a little ahead of ourselves, will be on Tuesday, April 1st at 7 p.m. right here. Historical Society board member John Ring, who is in our audience, and his cousin Thomas Tufts will present a talk about their great-grandfather, Professor James Tufts, and his influence on education and community life in Exeter. And we hope to see you there or here. But before that, Ornell's Barbecue in Kittery, Maine has been kind enough to make us the beneficiary of their community night on Thursday, March 20th from 4 to 9 p.m. 20% of the evening's proceeds will benefit the Historical Society, so we hope that you will join us for some Texas-style barbecue. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will it help our speaker hear you, but it will allow those online to hear you as well. If you are on Zoom or Facebook, please put your question in the comments section, and we will try our best to ask on your behalf. So just before I introduce our speaker, I want to note, or rather thank, the New Hampshire Humanities for sponsoring this event. They are a wonderful partner. We love the amazing programs that they bring to our community, so thanks to them. Tonight, we will be hearing, again, from Jane O'Neill, the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She curates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. I've heard Texas even. O'Neill holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I love that everyone is interested in fierce females. We're going to have a great time tonight looking at some incredible works of art together. Let's start off by acknowledging this fantastic woman on the screen. There's something about her that is very alluring, right? She's beautiful, she's strong. Let me tell you, this makes a great Halloween costume, very easy. But it's a marketing image. and it's a marketing image that was made by a man. Of course, it was made in the middle of World War II, 1943. This is J. Howard Miller's Rosie the Riveter. And it's an image with sort of a troubling history almost, because as seductive as it is to think about being strong and beautiful, so capable, it's an image that lured women out of their homes to work in manufacturing to support the war effort. But sadly, most of those women were still expected to be homemakers, Betty Crocker, back at home. So we are going to be talking about images made by men, images made by women, and I was so happy to hear that we have microphones that we can share with people in the audience today, because I wanted to start us off with a comparison here. And I'd like to ask you for your reactions to the comparison on the screen. And what I'd like you to sort of think about as you're looking at these two images are, what are the primary differences, or what speaks to you in terms of the differences, in terms of the way the man here has been painted and the woman has been painted? Do we have any brave souls who'd like to share their ideas? We've got a hand up in the back if we have any microphones. Sorry to put you right on the spot immediately.
Well, for one, the way we're meant to approach them with the image of Napoleon, it's like this is an image of power, of standing over us. Like, you're meant to be looking up to this person. Whereas with the woman at the mirror, it's much more personal. It's a little more intimate. It's like you feel more at the same level. There's less of that detachment of individual connection. It's like I much prefer the one on the right because I feel more personally connected to it. But the importance of the one on the left also has to be stated in the fact that it does record this valor, this big person.
Great, thank you. So there's a sense of sort of that this image of the man here who is Napoleon, that it's supposed to be impressive, that it's awe-inspiring, but that the image of the woman, at least for you, feels more intimate, feels like someone you could connect with. Great. Are there any other observations about the differences here that somebody would like to share?
Action, passive.
that is hitting the nail on the head, right? We have this sense of a man of action here, rearing up on a horse, controlling that horse with just one hand, right? The other hand is sort of summoning the armies behind him, but also this sense of courage and strength. And passive here, this woman is like sort of collapsing in on herself to a certain degree, isn't she, right? So his body's like, this is a power pose, it's expansive, and she's kind of diminutive. Any other final observations? Oh, we've got two hands up, so we'll hear from both of you.
He's out in the world and she's inside.
Yes. So he is a part of the world around us, and she is sort of inside, sort of contained, separated from everything else. So again, there's this sense of consequence, of importance to this figure, even if it wasn't Napoleon, because he is engaging with the world around us, whereas she's sort of limited in that way.
I'm looking at the way that they've depicted her with the softness and the light on her. And with him, it's dark shadows, dark clouds over him. But her, they're trying to show her in maybe what they think is her best light. And in him, it's the power is the light, is the important thing that they're showing.
Right. So there's something about the way that these images have been painted too, right? And the way that the artist is using light. I would say that there's like a real softness to her skin, the sort of the sheen of her dress here. There's some lace. Everything about it is sort of appealing and almost like tactilely pleasing. And there are these kind of harsh lights and darks in Napoleon's image. It's also an image that is painted crystal clear. clear, works very well as an image of propaganda. So all of these comments and contributions have been so good. Thank you for your bravery in sharing them. And I just want to kind of circle back to like the big ideas here. But the main one being that men and women have traditionally been painted very differently throughout the history of art. Men as being people of consequence, people of action, and women oftentimes just purely decorative. And there's a reason for this. I should mention too that in the history of art, there's something called the implied male gaze. And that comes from the idea that for centuries, it was men who were preparing to work as professional artists. They were making the art. And it was primarily art that they were making for other men to look at. So oftentimes when their subject was a woman, they could render that woman in such a way so that she's not even looking at you, seemingly unaware of your gaze, that renders her not just as a subject, but as an object that we can gaze upon without the discomfort of her staring back at us. So there's that idea of the implied male gaze that works, especially when we're thinking about historic images of women. So we're going to shift gears and we're going to think a little bit about tonight's title here, fierce. What does it mean to be fierce? This is a pretty fierce image right here. But I have a working definition for us because we have to sort of pin down what we're talking about today. Women who created art that defied expectations, pushed beyond the boundaries of what was considered appropriate, acceptable, or desirable for their time. This is a pretty fierce female on the screen. This was painted by a very young woman in her 20s back in the 1600s in Italy. Her name was Elisabetta Siriani. Most people don't know about her because she died mysteriously at the age of 27. But she did paint images of heroines, of tough women. In this case, it's an image from a story from classical antiquity of a woman who's actually throwing a man who had assaulted her down a well. So that man is about to meet his demise here, and I think he even knows it. So this is a pretty powerful woman sort of tossing that man in that ungainly pose to meet his end. I've got another image here on the screen for you, and this is a still from an art film by a Swiss artist named Pippoletti Rist. And this is a film that's in museum collections around the world. It's called Ever Is Over All. And what happens in the film is Pippoletti Rist is wearing this lovely blue dress, red heels, very feminine looking, walking down a city street, and then all of a sudden she starts smashing car windows. Sort of defies what you think she's going to do, right? It's certainly not behavior that we associate with being feminine or appropriate, right? Interestingly enough, the pop sensation Beyonce filmed a video where she did the exact same thing. And if you didn't know that Beyonce loved art, you might have just thought that she went through a bad breakup. But Beyonce is somebody who has cultivated this aura of fierceness around her, and oftentimes it's through quoting art history like we see here. But tonight is not about Beyonce. So tonight, I want to give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together. There is a lot of content to move through, a lot of women I'd like to introduce you to, and so for tonight's, I should say, each one of these women we could spend years talking about. Their religious beliefs, their political beliefs. Tonight we're just going to talk about what makes them fierce. So we're going to be moving pretty quickly. But we're going to get started with the briefest introduction to how women have contributed to the arts throughout the history of time. It's very brief, and it's designed to surprise you, okay? So let's get started with this very brief overview. All right. We're starting way back. Prehistoric cave paintings. I'm sure you didn't think we were going this far back, but it's like art history 101 here. So cave paintings, 30,000 years BC, right? We are looking at a cave painting in Chauvy, France. It's a particularly good cave painting because look at these overlapping horse heads. This is somebody who looked very carefully at horses to get the anatomy of those heads just right. And overlapping them, that almost suggests depth too, right? So we can see that we know prehistoric man went into these caves. They didn't live in the caves. They were dark and inhospitable places, but they went oftentimes very deep into some of these caves to make these images. Why? There's still a lot of speculation, but to be honest, we don't know. There are some art historians out there that think that they had religious or sort of ritualistic purposes. There's even theories out there that prehistoric man went into these caves for target practice because, I mean, the focus really is animals here. And if we look at these spotted horses from the Peshmeral cave, there's one horse head here, another horse head here. You can see all of these like little red dots. It's almost as though you could imagine someone throwing a spear at them, maybe. But I want to draw your attention to something else in this image. I want to draw your attention to the handprints on the wall. There are several of them. Those sort of function as like the very first artistic signatures in the world. That's pretty amazing, right? And I remember my Art History 101 textbook, I went back and found it. There was a little drawing, an illustration of how prehistoric man would have made those handprints because they're negative handprints. Prehistoric man, shown by this modern day artist wearing his beret, would have put minerals in his mouth, mixed it with his saliva, put his hand against the wall, and then spit the minerals at his hand in order to make these handprints. And here's the thing. There are handprints like this all over the world in prehistoric caves. This is the Cave of Hands. This is down in South America. Look, it's covered with these hands. And it was only about 15 years ago that archaeologists started measuring the hands. And they determined that 3/4 of those handprints are women's hands, which means that at the very foundation of art making on this planet, it's women. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't celebrate that enough. It's pretty profound. So we're going to zoom forward about 30,000 years. Are you ready for this? Don't get whiplash. Now we're in ancient Greece. We're looking at two ancient Greek vases here, and the vase painting is really what I'd like to draw your attention to. You can walk through any encyclopedic collection down at the MFA, down at the Met, and you'll see a lot of ancient Greek vases like this. And they oftentimes tell stories. These are two typical stories that you would see. War, so we've got a good battle scene going on here, and love, oftentimes homoerotic love, like we see over here. And for that reason, most art historians assume, that the people that were making these vases were probably men. We do have one incredible piece of evidence that tells us otherwise, and it is this giant mosaic. It's bigger than what we see here on the screen. It's about 17 feet long. It's a mosaic that was excavated in Pompeii, so, covered by the ash of Vesuvius. And here it is on the floor. It's this very detailed battle scene between Alexander the Great over here, Darius III. Look at all of these horses. Look at the chaos of the spears. Now, here's a detail of Alexander. When I say mosaic, you can see all of these tiny little tiles, these colored tiles that are used to put this together. Now, the reason this relates back to ancient Greek vase painting is that the entire design for this mosaic here originally appeared on an ancient Greek vase. And so it inspired one of the greatest works in the ancient world. And all we know about that vase painter was that her name was Helen of Egypt. how many other women were making art and making art that inspired great works like this one? Okay, we're moving forward another 1,000 years. And now we're in the Middle Ages, and we're looking at two examples of illuminated manuscripts. So think of all these monks who are translating the Bible or just transcribing the Bible. Very often they would create artwork in the margins, and sometimes they would even create their own self-portraits where they show themselves at work. What did it look like to work as a monk? Well, we actually have a self-portrait by a nun who was doing the same work. And so here we can see her with her hand up in the air. Again, it's almost like that affirmation of self. It's, I was here, I made this. And the text surrounding her says, Gouda, a sinner, wrote and made this book. Wrote and painted this book, I should say. This is believed to be the first signed self-portrait by a woman in the Western world. Dates to about 1290. Now, she was not alone. And we have physical evidence to prove this, because what we're looking at here is the jawbone from a nun who lived around the year 900. And in this nun's jawbone is this little blue stone. This blue stone is lapis lazuli. So this nun's bones tell us that this woman had access to lapis lazuli, which had to be imported from thousands of miles away. It was the most expensive material an artist could work with. And it was a stone that had to be ground up, like we see over here. So it would come in little bits, you grind it up, and you can make the most beautiful cobalt blue paint. So for a nun to have that little stone in her mouth meant that she had to have been one of the greatest artists of her day. We don't know her name. Now you might be thinking, how did it end up in her mouth? How does any of this make sense? Well, archaeologists believe that she might have been licking her paintbrush to keep it wet as she was painting, which is how that little blue stone is there. So just little shreds of evidence that tell us that women have been working all along, making these significant contributions. So now we zoom forward to the modern era. We're in America, and I'd like to introduce you to Edmonia Lewis. She was born a free black woman in America in 1840. She had an early interest in sculpture, and so she was largely self-taught. She began making these sculptural busts that she would actually sell on the sidewalks of Boston. This is a sculptural bust of John Brown, who of course tried to lead a slave rebellion. Eventually, she saved up enough money to go to Italy to receive the very best training in the world for a sculptor. And when America was celebrating its 100th anniversary, the centennial in 1876, there was a big exhibition as part of the celebration. Edmonia Lewis sent along a major work for that exhibition. This is the death of Cleopatra. It got a lot of attention, but not for the reasons you might think. People thought that this was kind of an ungainly pose for Cleopatra. Apparently she should have looked more seductive while she was dying. So it got a lot of attention, but maybe not for the best reasons. Anyway, when that exhibition was over, this sculpture, this 3,000-pound sculpture, disappeared. And over the years, it's been found in various places, like a saloon in Chicago. I believe it was at like a horse racing track, and like marked a horse's grave for a while. And then about 20 years ago, they found it in a salvage yard. Today, it's at the Smithsonian. What does it tell us about how we value the contributions of women artists for a 3,000-pound work like this to go missing? So now we are zooming ahead to 1970s, and now we are looking at this great painting by the artist Alice Neal, and the painting is of a woman named Linda Nochlin, who is famous for writing an essay called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" What a provocative title, right? So she has a couple of threads to her argument, and the first one is, we as a culture do not associate genius with women. It's really easy for us to say, Elon Musk, a genius, or Picasso, genius, Michelangelo, genius, right? But when's the last time you heard someone say, oh, Georgia O'Keeffe, a genius, Frida Kahlo, genius? We just don't treat women and men the same way in our culture. The next thread to her argument, and a really important one, is that there has been systemic barriers to arts education for women for centuries, for, tale as old as time, essentially. What we're looking at here is a painting from the 1700s. It's called the American School. This is where Americans would go to study in London if they wanted to become great artists in the 1700s. There are no women there. Women were not allowed to be there, and this is true right up until the end of the 19th century. What we're looking at here is a photograph from the École des Beaux-Arts, the premier art school in Paris, in France. No women there. And part of the reason for that, one of the reasons they kept women out, was that oftentimes artists study from nude models. They're learning anatomy, right? And it was believed that it was just inappropriate for women of good standing to bear witness to that, which is kind of a silly reason if you think about it. So this concludes really our very brief overview of the way women have contributed to the arts. And I have this great poster for you on the screen from a group called the Gorilla Girls. And they are an anonymous collective. They actually do wear gorilla masks like this when they have appearances or events. And they create these posters that probe and question the status of women in the art world. So do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? And the disparity of nudes in the Met versus the number of women whose work is on the wall. Now, we do know these things are changing. We'll talk a little bit about it as we go along. For now, we're going to switch gears and we're going to fly through this list of very fierce females that I wanted to introduce you to. But this is our background. This is to know that women have been there all along. They've been making things, but we as a culture have not honored it in the same way. Now, all that being said, there have been women going back centuries that have defied the odds, including Artemisia Gentileschi. And she was an Italian Baroque artist, so working in the 1600s. This is a really dark slide, I think. It might be a little bit hard to see, but this is her self-portrait here. And she is painting. She paints herself in the act of painting, but she's done something kind of special in this self-portrait to kind of thumb her nose at men. She calls herself the allegory of painting in this self-portrait. And that's something that no male artist could ever do. In art, an allegory is usually a nude female body. So if you wanted to do like the allegory of peace or the allegory of war, it would be like a nude female with bows and arrows or something like that. So here she is, the very embodiment, the physical embodiment of painting, and that's signified, it would have been something that was easily discerned by her contemporaries, by her messy hair and the fact that she's got this little necklace on that has a mask on it. So here she is saying, not only am I a woman making art, but I am the embodiment of painting, which is really showing off, I think. So how did she become an artist? Well, it was the family business. Her father was an artist. He had a big workshop where he trained other apprentices, and so she got to sort of learn at the master's knee. And what we're looking at here are two religious images, one by her father and one by Gentileschi herself, dealing with the same subject, a biblical subject that has traditionally allowed artists to paint a female nude. It's called Susanna and the Elders, and essentially the story is a young, beautiful woman was bathing in like a pond or a lake, and these two lecherous old men see her, and they basically threaten her reputation unless she goes along with what they want her to do. So we can see that her father has painted this scene where Susanna is these men have their hands on her, and she's sort of lifting her eyes up heavenward, sort of asking for help from God, maybe looking slightly annoyed. And what we see over here with Artemisia Gentileschi's rendering of the same subject is a woman who's twisting her whole body just at the whispers. There's a grimace on her face. She wants nothing to do with these men. And I would argue that the reaction that she has painted here is maybe more true to women's experience than what her father has portrayed. So the next image that we're going to look at is a little bit difficult to look at, but this is the Italian Baroque. Times were very dark. And Gentileschi fell right in line with that. She started creating some pretty dark and I think pretty disturbing paintings. A lot of art historians associate this to what was going on in her life, which was she had been attacked by one of her fellow students in her father's studio, and actually there was a long trial where she was subjected to torture, thumb screws, to prove that she was telling the truth. It wasn't just that turned her towards these kind of dark and violent images. This was very much the style of the time. So this is another biblical scene called Judith and Holofernes. And Judith is a Jewish heroine whose town was being laid siege to, and so she decides to seduce the general of that army that was laying siege, and then when he falls asleep, she would behead him. So we see the bloody act unfolding here, but we also have a very tough woman who's at the helm. This is her maidservant here. And there's this kind of remarkable choreography in the picture with Judith here, whose arms are sort of moving off at this diagonal, counterbalanced by Holofernes' legs. There's the push up and the push down here too. I'd like to compare this for you to the work by a male artist, the leading artist of the day, who had already painted the subject. And we can see here, it's not that same kind of choreography. His Judith here is much more delicate, sort of more removed from the act itself. I would say that Artemisia Gentileschi has painted a very strong, very fierce female. And for someone to endure what she endured in terms of torture, for telling the truth in a trial, and for finding opportunities to paint very strong women in the 1600s, she definitely qualifies as fierce. But we are going to fly forward once again. We are in the 1800s now, and we are in France. And I'd like to introduce you to Rosa Bonheur, who was the most famous woman artist in the entire century in France. And almost everything you need to know about Rosa Bonheur is right there in front of you. She's just hanging around with a bull, like they're best friends. She also came from a family of painters. That's how she learned to paint. And her family of artists specialized in animal pictures. So long before you could take 1,000 photos on your phone, people still wanted images of their pets and their beloved animals. And this is what the Bonheurs specialized in. They're sweet, they're realistic, kind of sentimental images. And she could have just gotten along very well making these kinds of images, but she kind of aspired for something more. And so for 2 years, she would go every week to the Paris horse market, which was a big deal event. People didn't have cars. You needed a horse to get around. And this was where you could go and see the new horses. And as we can see from this image, it's a very lively event where, all of these horses are moving. They're rearing up. There's this great sense of motion. So after 2 years, she produces this huge painting. It's 16 feet across, 8 feet tall. I mean, just painting, if we were just to paint a wall that size, that would be exhausting, let alone an image like this. So she gets the horses just perfect. And as a woman watching all of this, she kind of stuck out. She actually had to get special permission from the French government to wear pants so that she could kind of blend in a little bit better. And believe it or not, she might have even painted herself right here at the center, looking out at us, probably feeling pretty proud of this incredible picture that she created. So Rosa Bonheur then dedicated her life to creating these huge paintings that celebrated animals. And she would go to abattoirs, she would go to veterinarian schools, she would go hunting. She wanted to know everything about animal anatomy anatomy. She was also, amazingly, openly gay at the end of the 19th century, and she would drink and she would smoke. She had 2 significant relationships in her life. Here she is with her second partner. She's also wearing the Grand Cross from the French Legion of Honor, which was the highest award that they had ever given, that they could give, and they gave it to her for her artistic contributions. There's a great quote from Rose Bonheur. She said to a friend once, a male friend, "If you only knew how little I care for your sex, you wouldn't get such queer ideas in your head. The fact is, in the way of males, I only like the bulls I paint." So for Rosa Bonheur, living her authentic life and painting these enormous, hyper-realistic images of these majestic animals, she definitely qualifies as fierce. Now, most people don't necessarily think of Mary Cassatt as a fierce female. One time a librarian wanted to fight me on this one. But she was the American expatriate living in France who got involved with the Impressionist art movement and is probably best known for her images of mothers and children. Here she is in a self-portrait in her 30s, I believe. Now, there are those images of mothers and children, and we've all probably seen these on calendars or cards or gotten a Mother's Day card with something like this. And I should mention that Mary Cassatt came from a very well-to-do background. And so as a woman who sort of needed a chaperone to move around Paris, working with other women as her clients in the domestic sphere was really all that she could do. But when you look at these sweet images of mothers and their babies and their children, you do get a sense that it's a little boring, right? I mean, look at this little girl here. She's like, "Where's my iPad," right? So Mary Cassatt had an artist friend named Edgar Degas. We can see him here in his self-portrait. And they had a real meeting of the minds. But Edgar Degas had a very different life. Because he was male, he could sort of move about Paris completely unfettered. And he made these fantastic images of Paris nightlife, of raunchy stage shows, like this one over here where this woman's kind of vamping. These women who are out on a cafe terrace at night, almost certainly courtesans, giving us this little slice of what Paris was like at the end of the 19th century. Mary Cassatt, the best she could do was tea parties, right? And again, it's a lot of women that look very strained and very bored, right? Although somebody once pushed back on that and they said she looks like she just shared a juicy bit of gossip. You never know. Now, I think Mary Cassatt is fierce because of this brief moment in her career where she and her sister Lydia started going to the Paris Opera. Lydia was 7 years older than her and could function as her chaperone. So here is the Paris Opera. If you've never been before, put it on your bucket list right now. We're standing on the stage here. Here is floor seating and several tiers of balconies that wrap around in a U shape. And being in those balconies was essentially like being on the cover of a magazine at the supermarket checkout. That you became a face that everybody was looking at. You were wearing things that everybody was looking at. It was a see and be seen event. And here's Lydia at the Paris Opera having the time of her life, smiling, showing her teeth even, and she's sitting in front of a mirror that shows us that she is looking out at all those other opera boxes and taking in the visual spectacle of it. So Mary Cassatt shows a number of women who are in those opera boxes, who are using their binoculars to engage in taking in the sights and sounds. They are essentially adopting the male gaze in these moments. And her most iconic image that relates to this is right down in Boston, and it's just called At the Opera, where we see this kind of serious-looking woman wearing a black dress, training her gaze through these binoculars. But if you kind of follow the line of where she's looking, it's slightly up. She's not focused on the stage. She's looking at other people. That's what we're here to do, right? And if you look at this balustrade, this balcony that she's leaning on, it curves all the way back to a man who's looking at her. I can sort of zoom in on that for you. So it's all about this exchange of glances, but Mary Cassatt gives these women agency. She shows them having fun. She shows them doing what essentially most men were doing at the opera. This is another Impressionist artist. This is Auguste Renoir. He shows us a very lovely woman at the opera. She's got 1,000 pearls and flowers and all of that, but she's not using her opera glasses while her date is very clearly checking other people out. So for this little moment where Mary Cassatt gives women the opportunity to adopt the male gaze, I would say she qualifies as fierce. We're heading into the 20th century now. I'm sure you've all heard of Georgia O'Keeffe before. Most famous, of course, for her flower paintings, her revolutionary flower paintings that she started doing in the 1920s. Well, a lot was happening for her in the 1920s. She'd just gotten together with the man who would be her husband, who's also the biggest mover and shaker in the art world in America. His name was Alfred Stieglitz, and he had a lot of opinions about where she should exhibit her work, how much she should price it for. He had essentially total control over her career. He was, and many of you have probably heard, the little rumors that these flowers maybe are something other than flowers. He was basically the one who put forward that idea. So here he is sort of telling her how to run her career, and they're living in New York City and living in a skyscraper, actually. She was one of the first American artists to live in a skyscraper. And Georgia O'Keeffe just didn't feel comfortable there. She kept trying to paint these skyscrapers and try to find a mode of expression for them. And her husband, who we see here, actually said, "Don't do it. Don't paint the skyscrapers. The male artists are having a hard enough time figuring out how to do this in the 1920s in America. Let them paint it." He actually wouldn't exhibit this work that she created over here until a few years after she had painted it. The second it went on the wall, it sold. And she recalled this like years later and sort of with a wry smile said, "They'd let me paint the city after that." But as most of you know, Georgia O'Keeffe ended up spending a great deal of her time in New Mexico. She still loved her husband, he loved her, they wrote to each other constantly, but she found freedom out in the desert. She loved the desert. Look at this photograph of her. She's smiling while holding this giant skeleton in her hand. She would walk through the desert picking up bones the way most of us would walk through like a field and picking up flowers. And so she loved to paint the desert landscape. She loved skulls, she loved bones. She found her mode of expression, and she began to blossom artistically because she was sort of out from underneath her husband's thumb. So for blazing her own trail, these are two great photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe from later on in her life, for kind of breaking free from that control and for essentially presenting the American West to the American public, I would say Georgia O'Keeffe definitely qualifies as fierce. Now, some of you might be newly familiar with Lee Miller. There's a movie out right now called Lee. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but she was actually a war correspondent, a photographer during World War II. She had started off her career as a model. She was a strikingly beautiful woman. I saw a picture where she met Picasso, and he was, of course, immediately taken with her. She had moved to New York City and was just trying to make her way, and apparently almost stepped into oncoming traffic. Somebody saved her life and pulled her back onto the sidewalk. That somebody was Condé Nast, and like 2 weeks later, she's modeling for Vogue. But she found that she was much more interested in what was happening on the other side of the camera. She moves to Europe to study photography. The war breaks out, and she could very easily have just come home and played it safe. But she decided instead she wanted to document what was happening all around her. This is a photograph of this sort of debris, this bombed out building with the demolished grand piano here. That's from the London Blitz. And over here we see this nurse. This is almost like another Rosie the Riveter right here. This was a nurse who was encamped down the beach from the beaches at Normandy, and her little group of nurses there, I think they saw like something like 4,500 patients in a month and only lost about 50 of them. So talk about a fierce female. So all the while, Lee Miller is sending these images back to the United States because she really felt like if people don't see what's happening, they won't believe it. So as the war is winding down, as the concentration camps are being liberated, Lee Miller went to the concentration camps. She went to Buchenwald and Dachau. And like I said, these camps had been liberated and prisoners were parading around outside celebrating. Nobody really knew where they should go at that point, but there were still very sick and emaciated people who couldn't celebrate. And she documented that, and she sent this image back to Vogue magazine with the caption, "Believe it." Because of course, it's too horrific to even imagine. And it's the kind of thing we don't want to believe. But Lee Miller wanted this to be documented and shared with the world. So here she is in Germany, and she gets word of Hitler's death, of his suicide. You'll never believe what she does next. She breaks into Hitler's apartment, and she takes her first bath in 3 weeks. There's the dirt of the concentration camps still on those boots. And she and her photography partner staged this photograph with Hitler's picture on the edge of his tub here. And I'm sure they probably brought in the figurines and that sort of thing, where she becomes the model once again, but really kind of showcasing what she's been through there in Europe, right? So I mentioned that there's a movie. Here is Kate Winslet recreating the famous bathtub picture over here. But for staying in Europe during World War II, for going to the concentration camps, for documenting all of this for the world to see, Lee Miller qualifies as fierce. Now, most of you have probably heard of Frida Kahlo by this point. She is the famous Mexican artist with the unibrow and the slight mustache. She is someone who did oftentimes paint in bed. She was involved in a horrific trolley and bus accident when she was just about 18 years old. She broke her leg in 11 places. She broke her spine, she broke her shoulder, and she was impaled by the iron bar of that trolley. She spent the rest of her life really in unimaginable pain, waiting for the next surgery that she always hoped would provide some relief. So she created works of art throughout her life that show this kind of restrained, stoic expression that she had that really kind of played up that famous unibrow and the facial hair and celebrated her Mexican identity. Incidentally, she got these hand earrings from Picasso. I'd wear them too if Picasso gave them to me. But many of her paintings reference the physical pain that she was experiencing. So here she's wearing a thorn necklace, sort of like Jesus in the crown of thorns. But this is a painting that she had dedicated to one of her doctors. And so she's recalling that physical pain of the surgery here. This is, and I should mention that, despite what she was feeling, so often what we see is that stoic expression. This is a painting that she created for one of her doctors towards the end of her life, when by this time she's using a wheelchair. This doctor here in, I think it was 1951, he had actually performed 7 surgeries on her spine in that 1 year. It's so hard to imagine. So not only does she really nail his likeness in her painting, but she paints her artist palette with an anatomical heart on it. So really kind of drawing together both of their expertises here. But what Frida Kahlo is so famous for is just kind of laying bare the torture that she was experiencing because of that accident. In this self-portrait here called Broken Column, she's ripped open her body to reveal a broken spine. In the in the guise of a classical column. And the landscape behind her is similarly torn open. She's wearing this brace, which she did in fact have to wear for much of her life, that was essentially holding her torso together. And she's covered her body in these little pins and nails. And even though she still has that stoic expression, there are tears running down her cheeks that she can't contain here. This is so raw, so visceral, so vulnerable. There is really nothing else like this in the history of art. I was talking with somebody someday and they said, oh, well, Van Gogh, he was tortured and his self-portraits are really something. Well, he never actually ripped his body open in any of his self-portraits. In 1946, Frida Kahlo underwent several back surgeries that year too. She was so hopeful that they would provide her some relief. And after she found out that they were not successful, she created this picture called Wounded Deer, where she puts her face on the body of a deer, a male deer, interestingly, but she was always kind of playing with gender throughout her life. And this deer has been pierced by something like 9 arrows. There's no way it's going to live, right? It's not in the desert now, but in this kind of like dry and cracked landscape, this forest here. And it stares out at us, sort of serenely, accepting its fate. Now, believe it or not, Frida Kahlo gave this painting to friends as a wedding present. Imagine unwrapping that one and thinking, oh, this will look great over my sofa. So she had a sense of humor. And that's probably how you can understand this last picture from her too. This one's called The Dream of the Bed from 1940. And I think it's actually an optimistic picture. Her canopy bed is like flying through the clouds. It's a little bit surrealist, right? And she is resting peacefully, and there are these green vines coming up from the foot of the bed and leafing out over her body. To me, that is like regeneration. It's renewal. But right over her bed is this giant smiling skeleton that is actually wired with dynamite. So even in, a blissful sleep, she's reminding us that death can happen at any moment. Believe it or not, she actually had that skeleton on her very bed. She thought it was funny. I guess her husband didn't love it. Anyways, for showing us her pain, for being that vulnerable, for enduring it and surviving it for as long as she did, Frida Kahlo definitely qualifies as fierce. We have just 2 more to go. Are you ready? This is Elizabeth Catlett, and she worked as a sculptor and a printmaker for the majority of the 20th century. She was half Black and half Mexican. I want to show you some of her prints because they are outstanding. She wanted to work in a realist style, and she wanted to work in printmaking, which meant that her images could be reproduced fairly easily, and she could disseminate them as widely as possible. So this is an image of a Black woman that we're looking up at. Whenever you look up at a figure, you're sort of exalting them, and she looks like a strong person. She looks like a person that has maybe been through a lot. And we can see that there's a little safety pin that's keeping her jacket closed. And Elizabeth Catlett named this work Sharecropper. So right there, we understand that this is a person that is stuck in an endless cycle of financial exploitation, right? And so we see that strength in a whole new way. This is from 1952 when sharecropping was still alive and well. She not only painted what was happening in the 20th century, but she also made prints of African American history. This is, of course, Harriet Tubman leading slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad. So we've got this hierarchy of scale. She's this much larger figure, a very powerful figure with a powerful gesture here. She's got her rifle, and she's got all of the people that she is leading to safety. But I think what's probably most remarkable is that Elizabeth Catlett also made images about injustice and discrimination in the middle of the 20th century. Over here, we can see a figure that has a noose around his neck. It almost looks like someone who's been lynched and cut down, because we can see the feet sort of standing on the rope here. And over here, we're looking at several black women who are sitting at the back of the bus with the sign here for colored only. And we still know today what a sensitive topic race is in this country. And I can't imagine that she could have made these images in the middle of the 20th century without getting some hateful feedback about it. I want to leave you with this sculpture that she created, which I just find, I love this work. It looks like an eternally modern work to me. This woman always looks like somebody that you'd see studying at Starbucks, but she made this back in the 1970s, and there are bronze reproductions of it in several major museums, including the Smithsonian. But she called this work Phyllis Wheatley, this thoughtful black woman. And Phyllis Wheatley was an important figure, or is an important figure in African American history, because back in the 1700s, she was captured into slavery, brought to America, and then learned several different foreign languages while she was here.